A racially charged call to the police about a man at her door unravels a chilling truth. What starts as a case of racial profiling ends in an explosive revelation. The night was thick with humidity, the air heavy like a wool blanket soaked in sweat. The dim glow of the streetlights flickered, casting eerie shadows across the pristine suburban lawns of Green Lake Drive. A faint scent of jasmine mixed with the damp earth from the earlier rainstorm. The pavement was still wet, reflecting the distorted halos of the lamps. A stray dog howled in the distance, breaking the silence of the night. Nathaniel Brooks stood just outside the White House at 104 Green Lake, his dark eyes scanning the surroundings, but never lingering too long on any one detail. He didn't mind the humidity, it reminded him of the thick tension in the air. He could feel it, like a heavy weight pressing down. But it wasn't the weather that had him on edge. It was her. Victoria Hayes. He'd been watching the house for a while, waiting for her to notice him, waiting for her to make the inevitable call. He knew what would happen next. The house was perfect, the neighborhood immaculate. It was a safe little bubble of privilege, and in her world, someone like him didn't belong. As he'd expected, the curtains twitched. She saw him. Victoria's reaction didn't surprise him. He'd seen it before, seen it 1,000 times. The subtle shift in posture, the tightening of the grip on her phone, the hurried call to 911. His presence alone was enough to ignite a fear he knew she couldn't control. He didn't take it personally. He had long ago learned to live with how people saw him. He didn't move as the sirens wailed, their bright lights flashing through the quiet streets of Green Lake. It wasn't fear that made his pulse quicken, it was the strange satisfaction of knowing that, in a few minutes, he would finally get to confront the person who was at the center of the mess he'd been investigating for weeks. 2 officers arrived, one older and stockier, the other younger, quicker to hesitate. Miller and Reese. Nathaniel had dealt with both before in different circumstances, and he knew Reese would be the more cautious one, while Miller would be eager to act. He could see the tension in the way they approached him, hands close to their holsters. He lifted his hands slowly, just as he had rehearsed. "I was just about to knock," he said, keeping his voice smooth, neutral. He heard Victoria's breath catch from behind the door, and despite himself, he smiled faintly. She was scared. He didn't want to scare her, but he didn't mind the discomfort either. She would need it to realize what was at stake. Reese barked an order for him to step away from the house, to provide identification. Nathaniel obeyed. Slowly, he retrieved his ID from his pocket, knowing the moment he handed it over, things would change. Miller's frown deepened as he examined the card, his eyes flicking back and forth from it to Nathaniel's face. The silence stretched. Nathaniel could hear Victoria's breath from behind the door, and the quiet thrill of the moment stirred in him. He'd made it this far. He knew she was already thinking, wondering who he was, why he was there. Then Miller laughed. A short, disbelieving chuckle. He turned to Victoria. "Ma'am, you might want to come out here." Nathaniel didn't need to see her face to know what was happening. He could feel it in the air, the way she was squirming, unwilling to accept the sudden shift. The police were supposed to protect her, but now the rules had changed. She emerged, arms crossed tightly, her posture defensive. Her eyes found his and quickly darted down to the ID. The recognition was instant, and he saw the shift in her expression. Nathaniel could practically hear her heart racing. He enjoyed the moment too much, the way her world was unraveling with just a single look at the name. Nathaniel Brooks. He had the power now. The power she had always tried to exert on others. He let her fumble with her words as she tried to grasp what was happening. She was confused, trying to find her footing again. He couldn't help but let his smirk widen, the cold amusement in his eyes matching the situation. "You called the police on a federal agent, Victoria," he said smoothly, his voice low and measured. That's a bold move. The pit of her stomach had to be in knots now. Miller cleared his throat, and Nathaniel turned his attention back to the officers. I was about to knock, he said casually, almost too calmly, but I guess our lovely hostess here thought I looked threatening. Victoria swallowed hard, and Nathaniel could see the gears turning in her mind. He took a step closer, letting his presence loom over her, just enough to unsettle her more. I have some questions for your husband, he said quietly. Is he home? The shock in her face was unmistakable. She stiffened, visibly recoiling at the mention of Richard Hayes. Nathaniel didn't need her to answer. He already knew everything he needed to know. Richard Hayes, Nathaniel pressed, his gaze never leaving hers. Where is he? Victoria's perfect little world was crumbling in that moment, and Nathaniel relished it. She was trying to keep her composure, but he could see the panic behind her eyes. She knew, deep down, that whatever had brought him here was far worse than what she had imagined when she made the call. Richard. Her perfect husband. The man who had given her the life she always wanted. The man who had hidden his secrets so carefully, who thought he could get away with it. But Nathaniel knew better. Victoria swallowed again, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered. Nathaniel tilted his head, his smile thinning. Oh, I think you do, he murmured. The walls were closing in. He could see it, the fear, the recognition, the panic rising within her as the pieces fell into place. She had called the police on him, thinking him the enemy. But now, it was her own life that was at risk. She was the one being hunted. Victoria's fingers clenched into fists at her sides. Nathaniel could see the tension in her posture, the way her shoulders stiffened, the subtle trembling of her hands as she tried to regain control. It didn't surprise him. He knew she had an image to uphold, a facade of power and grace that had to remain intact. But Nathaniel also knew the truth. She was scared. The air between them was thick, suffocating. He could feel the weight of it, that charged silence hanging like a storm cloud waiting to break. He stood there, calm, composed, everything she wasn't in that moment. His hands slipped casually into his pockets, his eyes never leaving her face. He could see the cracks forming, the forced confidence in her voice as she straightened, lifting her chin in an attempt to regain some of the control she had lost. My husband isn't home, she said coolly, her voice attempting to sound firm, dismissive. And I have no idea why a federal agent would be looking for him. Nathaniel raised an eyebrow, a slight smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Is that so? His tone was smooth, measured, as if he were humoring her. Her response came quickly, almost too quickly. Yes, she snapped. Now, unless you have a warrant, I'd appreciate it if you left my property. Nathaniel could hear the tension in her words. She was trying to force herself to stay composed, to push him out of her world. But he knew better. He knew how fragile her world was, how easily it could shatter. Officer Miller shifted uncomfortably. Ma'am, Agent Brooks is with the FBI. If he's here, it's serious. Victoria shot him a sharp look. It was clear she didn't appreciate Miller's support. But Nathaniel wasn't concerned with Miller. He was watching her. He allowed his smirk to widen just a fraction. Victoria, I didn't come here to play games, he said smoothly, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the silk. And I certainly didn't come here to be harassed by the police because a nervous housewife thought I looked dangerous. The insult hit its mark. Nathaniel saw the flush of heat rise to her cheeks, her composure cracking just for a moment. Housewife. He knew exactly what he had just done, pushed her further off balance, forced her to confront the reality that she wasn't the one in control anymore. That was the most dangerous thing to do to someone like her. And Nathaniel relished it. She crossed her arms tightly, forcing a brittle smile. I don't appreciate your tone, Agent. Yeah, well, Nathaniel interrupted smoothly, I don't appreciate being racially profiled, so I guess we're even. Miller let out a low cough, and Reese shifted his weight uncomfortably. It wasn't the first time Nathaniel had had to use that card to make a point, and he could see it was hitting home. The shift in the atmosphere was palpable. Victoria clenched her jaw, but before she could respond, Nathaniel raised a hand, silencing her. Like I said, I have questions for your husband. His eyes darkened slightly, sharpening. And I strongly suggest you cooperate, Victoria. The way he said her name, almost as if he were tasting it, sent a cold shiver down her spine. She hated it. Hated him. But more than anything, she was afraid. Nathaniel didn't miss the slight tremor in her stance, the way her gaze darted nervously between him and the officers. She was trying so hard to hold on to whatever control she had left, but he could see the fear lurking beneath her icy exterior. Before she could speak again, the unmistakable sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the tension. Nathaniel turned his head slightly, watching the headlights flash across the lawn. It was exactly as he'd hoped. Richard Hayes. The black Mercedes came to a slow stop, and Nathaniel felt the shift in the air as Richard stepped out, adjusting his cuffs with that calm, practiced manner. He looked every inch the part of the perfect, polished man Victoria had married. But Nathaniel knew better. He knew what Richard was. What he had done. Richard glanced briefly at the flashing red and blue lights, then at Nathaniel, then finally, at Victoria. Victoria, he said smoothly, closing the car door. What's going on? Victoria's tight-lipped smile did little to hide the panic that flashed across her face. She was in too deep now. The carefully crafted facade she wore, the persona of the dutiful wife, none of it could save her. Nothing, darling, she said, forcing the lie out. Just a little misunderstanding. Nathaniel turned to fully face Richard, his expression unreadable. Mr. Hayes. Victoria might not have noticed it, but Nathaniel saw the briefest hesitation in Richard's eyes, a flicker of recognition. Most people wouldn't have caught it. But Nathaniel did. Richard recognized him. He was pretending not to, but Nathaniel could see it. I'm sorry, Richard said, his voice effortlessly polite, stepping forward. Have we met? Nathaniel didn't blink. Not yet. He pulled out his sleek black leather wallet and flipped it open. Nathaniel Brooks, FBI. Richard let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head as if this were some kind of joke. FBI? Well, this is certainly unexpected. He glanced at Victoria, an almost imperceptible shift in his gaze. I assume there's been some mistake? Nathaniel's smile was cold, calculating. No mistake, Mr. Hayes. His voice dropped lower, the silk masking the steel. I've been looking for you. Victoria's pulse quickened. Nathaniel could feel it in the way she shifted on her feet, in the way her eyes darted between him and Richard. Richard, to his credit, didn't react outwardly. He simply smiled that practiced, perfect smile. Is that so? Nathaniel tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing. You and I have a lot to talk about. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, ready to snap. The air seemed heavier now, thicker with the weight of the moment. Nathaniel could feel the balance of power shifting, his presence pressing down on both of them, leaving no room for pretense or lies. And then, for the first time, Nathaniel saw it in Victoria's eyes. She was no longer in control. Nathaniel Brooks had been in law enforcement long enough to recognize a liar. And Richard Hayes? He was a damn good one. The man barely blinked as he met Nathaniel's gaze, his smile polished to perfection. A well-trained mask. The kind only men with something to hide learn to wear. Nathaniel had spent months investigating Richard, tracing his money, his movements, his connections. On paper, he was impeccable, a wealthy businessman, a devoted husband, a well-respected philanthropist. But Nathaniel had dug deeper. And what he found was rotting beneath the surface. Now, standing in front of him, Nathaniel could practically smell it. The fear. Not much. Barely there. But there. And that was enough. Richard Hayes knew exactly why the FBI was at his doorstep. Nathaniel studied the man carefully. Richard had the presence of a predator, the kind that thrived in boardrooms and country clubs, the kind that didn't get his hands dirty but had plenty of people to do it for him. Nathaniel had taken down men like him before. But Victoria? She was an interesting variable. She was still standing beside Richard, stiff as a statue, arms crossed tightly over her chest. She was pretending to be unaffected, but Nathaniel didn't miss the way her fingers dug into her arms, gripping herself like she was trying to hold something together. Richard hadn't even acknowledged her since stepping out of the car. Not a glance. Not a touch. And that was very telling. Nathaniel let the silence stretch, keeping his expression neutral. Then, he pulled out a crisp, folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "Richard Hayes," he said, watching the man's face carefully. "You're under federal investigation for financial crimes, conspiracy, and," Nathaniel let his voice drop just slightly, just enough, "human trafficking." There it was. The smallest flicker of something in Richard's eyes. Not shock. Not confusion. Just a flicker, quickly buried beneath a practiced, effortless chuckle. "Trafficking?" Richard repeated, shaking his head in amusement. "That's quite the accusation, Agent Brooks." Nathaniel didn't smile. "I don't make accusations, Mr. Hayes." He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I build cases." The air shifted. Even the officers, standing a few feet away, felt it. Nathaniel could see Officer Miller straighten slightly, tense, like he was suddenly realizing that this was bigger than just a routine police call. Victoria took a sharp breath. "And Richard?" For the first time, the perfect mask slipped, just a fraction. A tightening of his jaw. A calculation in his eyes. Nathaniel had seen that look before. The look of a man wondering if he could get out of this. If he could manipulate his way to safety. If he needed to run. Nathaniel flicked his gaze to Victoria, just for a second. She was blinking rapidly, her lips slightly parted. And suddenly, he understood something. She didn't know. Not fully. She knew Richard was hiding things, knew he was controlling, secretive. But this? This was beyond her. Nathaniel almost felt sorry for her. Almost. Because Victoria Hayes wasn't innocent either. She had spent years benefiting from Richard's money. Living in her perfect house. Looking down at people like Nathaniel, like they were less than her. But she wasn't the mastermind here. She was just another pawn. Maybe even a queen, but queens were still just pieces on the board. And Nathaniel had come to end the game. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, tilting his head. "You're nervous, Richard." The man chuckled. "Should I be?" Nathaniel smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Oh, definitely." Richard's jaw twitched. "You don't have anything on me." Nathaniel let a slow smirk curl on his lips. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." Silence. Victoria's breathing was shallow now. Her gaze darted between them, like she was realizing, too late, what she had married. Nathaniel turned his full attention to her. "Tell me, Mrs. Hayes," he said smoothly. Did you know that your husband has overseas accounts linked to missing persons? Victoria's face went ghost white. I don't, she turned sharply to Richard. Richard, what is he talking about? Richard's jaw clenched. I don't know where you're getting this, Agent Brooks, he said, voice low. But you're clearly mistaken. Nathaniel smiled. There it was. The first crack. The first sign of panic. And he wasn't done yet. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just for Richard. You ever hear the name Sofia Alvarez? And just like that, Richard Hayes paled. His hands curled into fists. Bingo! Nathaniel had him. Nathaniel watched the color drain from Richard Hayes' face. Sofia Alvarez. The name hit like a hammer, shattering whatever composure Richard had left. His jaw clenched so tightly it looked like his teeth might crack. For the first time, the mask slipped completely. Beneath the carefully curated charm, beneath the expensive suit and the polished arrogance, there was something ugly lurking underneath. And Nathaniel saw it all. Victoria took a step back, her eyes darting between them. Her lips parted, but no words came out. It was clear now, she had no idea who Sofia Alvarez was. But Richard did. And that was all Nathaniel needed to know. A tense silence stretched between them, thick as a noose. Nathaniel let it sit. Let Richard feel it. Because men like him, they weren't used to feeling powerless. Then, finally, Richard spoke. I have no idea who that is, he said smoothly, but his voice had lost its confidence. Nathaniel chuckled softly. Really? Because she knew you. A flicker of something in Richard's eyes. A hesitation. Nathaniel pressed forward. She was 19, Richard. His voice was quiet, but sharp as a blade. She went missing 2 years ago. He tilted his head. She was last seen leaving an event, one your company sponsored. Victoria let out a sharp inhale beside them. Richard's eyes snapped to her, a silent warning passing between them. But Victoria, for once in her life, didn't back down. Instead, she took another step away from him. Nathaniel didn't miss it. The way Victoria's expression shifted. The way her breathing turned uneven. She knew something. Maybe not everything, but enough. Nathaniel turned his attention to her. Victoria, he said, keeping his voice measured, controlled. Do you recognize the name? Her lips trembled. She swallowed. No. Lie. Nathaniel could see it in her eyes. She was cracking. Realizing. Maybe for the first time, she was seeing Richard for who he really was. Not a powerful, successful husband. Not a man who provided her with wealth and status. But something much, much worse. Richard's fingers twitched at his sides. Nathaniel recognized the restraint in his posture. He was trying not to lose his temper. In front of the police. In front of his wife. Nathaniel smirked. So that's how this works, huh? He gestured between them. You don't ask questions. He keeps you comfortable. And as long as you don't know too much, you can pretend everything is fine. Victoria flinched. Richard's head snapped toward him, his expression darkening. You're out of line, Richard said coldly. But Nathaniel had seen the truth now. Victoria was afraid of her husband. Not just now. Not just because of the FBI standing at her doorstep. But always. It was buried beneath layers of privilege and pride, but it was there. Nathaniel had seen that fear in countless women before. Women who had been controlled. Manipulated. Used. Victoria Hayes was not innocent. But maybe, just maybe, she was a prisoner too. Nathaniel turned back to Richard. "I have enough evidence to take this further," he said calmly. "We both know that." He let the words sink in. "I suggest you cooperate." Richard laughed. But it wasn't amusement. It was rage barely held together. "You have nothing," he said through gritted teeth. "You're bluffing." Nathaniel smiled. "Try me." And that was it. The moment Richard snapped. His hand shot out, fast, but Nathaniel was faster. He grabbed Richard's wrist before it could reach him, twisting it slightly, just enough to make a point. A warning. The officers stepped forward instantly, hands hovering over their holsters. Victoria gasped, stepping back like she had just woken up from a nightmare. Nathaniel leaned in. His voice was low. "Dangerous. Assaulting a federal agent," he murmured. "Not a great look, Richard." Richard yanked his arm back, breathing hard. His carefully composed demeanor was gone now. All that was left was anger. And fear. Because he finally understood. Nathaniel wasn't going away. And neither was this investigation. Nathaniel straightened his jacket. "Here's what's going to happen," he said. "You're going to come in for questioning. You're going to answer my questions. And if you don't," he smirked, "I'll make sure your entire empire comes crashing down." Richard said nothing. But his silence spoke volumes. Nathaniel turned to the officers. "We're done here for tonight." Officer Miller nodded, but his eyes lingered on Richard, like he was seeing him in a new light. Nathaniel took one last look at Victoria. Her expression was a storm of emotions. Confusion. Shock. And maybe, just maybe, regret. Nathaniel didn't know what role she would play in all of this. But one thing was certain. The cracks had started to form. And soon, everything would crumble. Nathaniel didn't wait to see the look on Richard's face. He could already imagine it, fear hiding behind the facade of arrogance. The officers were still lingering by the door, watching carefully as he moved past them. He didn't need to see Richard's expression to know the man was about to collapse. The empire he had so carefully built was already beginning to crumble. The mask of the perfect, powerful husband, the untouchable man, was gone. And as Nathaniel walked away, he could feel the weight of what had just been uncovered. The truth was dangerous. But it was a truth that needed to be exposed. Richard Hayes wasn't just involved in corruption or fraud. No. He was a man who had hidden his darkest actions behind his wealth, behind his carefully crafted public image. The web he had woven was far deeper than Nathaniel had anticipated. And now, as the layers peeled away, the ugly truth was emerging. As Nathaniel stepped outside, he caught a glimpse of Victoria standing by the window, watching from inside. Her face was pale, her body stiff as if still unsure how to process the chaos unfolding before her. Had she really not known the depths of Richard's actions? Or had she simply chosen to ignore them? Nathaniel couldn't tell. But he knew this, she was just as trapped as the victims Richard had used. Maybe even more so. As Nathaniel made his way to his car, his phone buzzed in his pocket. The screen flashed with a message from his superior. He unlocked it, reading the brief. "We've got the full records on Sofia Alvarez. There's more than you think. Get ready to dig deeper." Nathaniel's jaw tightened. Sofia Alvarez was the key to breaking Richard's empire, but what he had uncovered so far was just the surface. He had to stay focused. There was still so much to unravel. And the clock was ticking. As the night wore on, Nathaniel sat in his car, parked just a few blocks away from the Hayes estate, reviewing the files again. He had gone over them 100 times before, but something was still bothering him. Something about Victoria's reaction didn't sit right. She seemed shocked. She seemed confused. But there was also an unmistakable flicker of recognition in her eyes when Sophia's name was mentioned. Was she really in the dark? Or had she known all along? Was she complicit in the lies, just like Richard? Nathaniel wasn't sure. But he was going to find out. And then, the thought struck him like a lightning bolt. What if Richard wasn't the only one pulling the strings? He turned the car engine over, his fingers tapping against the steering wheel. The file on his passenger seat was full of incriminating evidence against Richard. But there was something about Victoria's role that Nathaniel couldn't ignore. She had to be more than just a victim of circumstance. The realization came in a rush. Nathaniel wasn't just dealing with a man who had built an empire on lies, he was facing a collaboration. A partnership built on greed and deceit. And Victoria Hayes had been an active participant. Nathaniel's gut told him that this investigation was about to get much more complicated. As Nathaniel dialed his superior's number, a sense of urgency washed over him. It was time to take things to the next level. He needed more than just the evidence. He needed to expose the truth, the whole truth. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Raymond, his superior's voice came through the line, tight and professional. "Get me everything you've got on Victoria Hayes," Nathaniel said, his tone clipped. "She's not just a bystander in this. She's been in this up to her neck." There was a pause on the other end of the line, the tension palpable even over the phone. "I'll send it over right now," his superior replied. "But be careful. We've just confirmed there's more at play here than we thought. Victoria might be more connected to the core of this operation than you realize." Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Thanks," he said, hanging up without another word. He glanced back at the Hayes mansion, the lights in the windows now dimmed. The house that had once been the symbol of power and success was now just a shell of what it had been. And Victoria? She was just a piece of the puzzle. A piece he had to figure out. When the documents arrived, Nathaniel pored over them with a new intensity. The evidence was damning. But there was one document that caught his attention, an email chain between Richard and Victoria from just a few weeks ago. In it, Victoria had written, "I think we've taken things as far as we can. We need to be smarter, more cautious. I can't have anyone getting too close to me. There are people watching." Nathaniel leaned in closer, scanning the rest of the exchange. Richard's reply was terse. "I'll handle it. But you need to remember who got you here, Victoria. If you turn on me now, you'll lose everything." There it was. A threat wrapped in a promise. Victoria had been aware of the consequences. She had been warned. And yet, she had chosen to stay by Richard's side. She was complicit. She had been playing her part, just as much as he had been. Nathaniel's stomach twisted with the weight of it all. Victoria hadn't been a naive victim, she had been an active participant in her husband's empire. But the real question was, why had she stayed? Nathaniel's mind raced as he reviewed everything. The lies. The manipulation. The deaths. Was she afraid of Richard? Or was there something else? Something darker? The answer loomed just out of reach, like the final piece of a puzzle that was still missing. But Nathaniel was close. Too close to stop now. He turned off the car engine, stepping out into the night. There was still more to uncover, and he was more determined than ever to find the truth, no matter the cost. Because if there was one thing Nathaniel knew for sure, it wasn't just Richard Hayes who had blood on his hands. Victoria's hands were stained too. And the truth? The truth was going to destroy them both. Nathaniel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel, his heart pounding in his chest. He had come this far, too far to back down now. The weight of the evidence he'd gathered, the twisted web of corruption, lay heavy in his mind. He knew he was close, but something about tonight felt different. The shadows were darker, the silence thicker. The Hayes estate loomed before him, its lights dim but still burning. Victoria was in there. And she was expecting him. Nathaniel reached for his phone again, dialing Raymond's number with urgency. He needed confirmation, some reassurance. "Raymond," came the voice on the other end. "I need everything on Victoria." "Now," Nathaniel ordered. "No more secrets." There was a pause before Raymond responded, his voice laced with hesitation. "You really want to dig into this, Nathaniel? Trust me, it's worse than you think. She's not just involved, she's orchestrating the whole thing." Nathaniel's grip tightened. "What do you mean?" Raymond's voice dropped lower. "She's the one pulling the strings. Not Richard. Victoria's connected to dangerous people, people we haven't even scratched the surface of. She's been laundering money through underground operations, using her power to shield Richard from the consequences." Nathaniel's stomach churned. All this time, he'd believed Richard was the key player. But the truth was worse, Victoria was the mastermind. "I've been chasing the wrong person," Nathaniel muttered under his breath. Raymond's voice was grim. "You have no idea what you're walking into. She's smart, Nathaniel. She's been covering her tracks for years. Watch yourself." As the call ended, Nathaniel sat back, taking in the magnitude of what he was up against. The whole operation, the money laundering, the lies, the manipulation, was run by Victoria. She wasn't just the power behind Richard, she was the architect, the planner. This was her world, and Nathaniel had only just stepped into it. He glanced at the mansion again, his eyes narrowing as a shadow moved quickly behind the curtains. Victoria knew he was coming. The game had changed. Nathaniel grabbed his jacket, took a deep breath, and stepped out of the car. Every step toward the mansion felt heavier than the last, each one bringing him closer to the heart of the conspiracy. He reached the front door, his hand hovering over the knocker when he heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps behind him. He turned. A tall figure stood at the edge of the porch, a man in a dark trench coat. Nathaniel's instincts flared. This was no random bodyguard, this man was dangerous. Before Nathaniel could react, a voice from the doorway called out, smooth but laced with authority. "Detective, please leave." Victoria's voice rang out, calm and controlled. "You're not welcome here." Nathaniel's gaze never left the man in the trench coat as he stepped closer to the door, his voice steady. "This isn't over, Victoria. Not by a long shot." Victoria's eyes narrowed as she stepped forward, her heels clicking on the marble floor. "You think this is about Richard? How naive. You've been chasing the wrong person, detective. All this time, it's been me you've been looking for. I'm the one pulling the strings. I'm the one in control." Nathaniel's mind raced as the pieces clicked together. Victoria wasn't just complicit, she was the mastermind behind everything. Richard, her husband, was just a puppet. Victoria had been playing a much bigger game, hiding in plain sight. But then the man in the trench coat took a step forward, his presence even more imposing now. "You should have stayed away," the man growled, his voice like gravel. Nathaniel's heart pounded. The tension in the air was suffocating. He had to move fast. But just as the situation escalated, something clicked in his mind. The man in front of him, the one with the sinister smile, wasn't just any bodyguard. He was Sofia Alvarez's father. Nathaniel's breath caught in his throat as the realization slammed into him. All this time, he had been searching for Sofia Alvarez, the missing woman who had somehow vanished without a trace. But now, in front of him, was the truth. She hadn't disappeared, she had been hidden. By Victoria. By her father. Sophia, Nathaniel whispered, his voice barely audible. She's not dead. The man grinned, his teeth glinting in the dim light. She might as well be, he muttered, stepping closer. The weight of the revelation hit Nathaniel like a sledgehammer. Sophia Alvarez wasn't just a victim, she was a part of the conspiracy. Hidden away by Victoria and her father, her disappearance had been planned from the start. She was just another piece in Victoria's twisted game. Nathaniel's knees felt weak under the pressure of the truth. The investigation had never been about finding Sophia, it had always been about uncovering Victoria's empire. Before he could gather his thoughts, the man lunged at him, forcing Nathaniel to step back, his hand instinctively reaching for his gun. But as he did, the sound of sirens filled the night air. Back up. Finally. Victoria's confident expression faltered for the briefest moment, but it was enough. The man in the trench coat hesitated, looking toward the gates as officers stormed the estate. Nathaniel knew the game was up. Victoria Hayes, the woman who had manipulated everyone around her, the one who had orchestrated a massive underground operation, was finally going to pay for her crimes. She had underestimated him. She had underestimated the law. As the officers moved in to arrest her and Sophia's father, Nathaniel allowed himself a moment of relief. It wasn't over yet. The investigation would continue, the corruption would be unraveled, but at least now, the mastermind was in custody. Victoria Hayes was no longer in control. Nathaniel's fight was far from over, but for the first time, he felt like he was on the right side of history.